post this and I'm gonna go ahead and back to sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen okay now?
Yes.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, so moving into some additional tools that we have available for us, the PDCA cycle is one that I'm sure you've heard in a lot of different classes that had any sort of lean contribution, because the PDCA cycle, Plan, Do, Check, Act, also seen as Plan, Do, Study, Act, sometimes in some literature, we really look at kind of going through multiple steps. And so this planning, this identification of the problem can be one of the most difficult pieces, not because we don't see where problems are, although that's part of the value stream mapping, is to identify those problems. Part of it is getting it down to a singular solvable case, because in lean, we really tried to break out individually singular issues for us to evaluate. Um, in Six Sigma, we'll look at a huge multi-million-dollar project and everything will be broken out into individual tasks. But when we talk about lean, we're often looking at that Kaizen method, which is just a small individual problem. And so we might have a system that we're solving multiple problems for, but we're going to do it sequentially, one at a time, as we work through here. And so identifying and quarantining the problem, getting the right people involved, is all part of that first section, which we'll talk about when we go through the problem solving method using DMAIC. Very simple, defined stage is quite similar to what we're talking about here. The root cause analysis has a couple different tools we'll talk through, and then we're generating our different alternatives. And part of the lean problem solving methodology that is least implemented in industry is this check part, that you actually test the alternatives. Most of them do plan, do, act, PDA. And we all know that PDA is not appropriate at work. So that's a good way to remember that you need to do your check, because just like you wouldn't make out with someone at work, you also should not just be doing plan, do, act. You should be doing plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, study, act. So when we talk about that root cause problem solving, one of these first ways is doing a basic brainstorming or affinity diagrams. And this is one of my favorite little techniques. And when you guys start doing your projects, we might hit these again and do some examples. Obviously, we won't be doing that today, but one of my favorite things with brainstorming is when we use sticky notes and we group our like factors together with a whole bunch of stickies. This actually helps us through the affinity diagram, can lead us directly into our Ishikawas or the fishbone diagram, and we'll see that in a second. So 5 whys is another root cause problem solving technique that you just have to like build on your inner 4-year-old and just keep saying why until you reach the logical conclusion. This method is just really difficult to navigate when you have individuals who think there's a different why. And that's why I have this note about rabbit trails, because sometimes people will say, well, that's happening because such and such, and they kind of go down a separate path that's not the direct contributor. So as simplistic as it seems, when you're facilitating this in group sessions and working with a team, having everyone agree on a straight line of how these 5 whys unfold can actually be more difficult than it sounds. The cause and effect diagram, C&E diagram, Ishikawa diagram, we call it a million different things, is a really helpful way to grouping things into separate processes. Now, if you remember our affinity diagram picture, we had all those post-its. If you labeled those post-its into these fishbone categories, you could translate your affinity diagram directly into a fishbone diagram, which is helpful because then our affinity diagram, which just has groupings of post-its, would then be broken into these additional bones of the fish where you have primary causes, secondary causes, and that's where you can actually capture some of the relational elements between these different things. That's also helpful on the 5 whys, that you can kind of capture like, well, that's actually not a process issue, that's an equipment issue, or that's not actually a process issue, that's a materials issue. So very typically in industry, I would be using multiple tools simultaneously, because every different way we look at the material gives us a new way of seeing the issue. And oftentimes people are able to note things and say, "Oh, well, I had thought of that as a process issue, but you're right. That's actually more of an equipment limitation." Well, an equipment limitation is going to be handled differently than a process issue. Like Leo was just talking about, if you had I'm not going to use the right terms, Leo, but if you have the roller thingy that can go directly to forming without having to go through the oven, you could eliminate a whole step. That's an equipment issue. The process includes that sequence, but it's a limitation or constraint of the roller that keeps you from being able to go directly from rolling to forming. You need to go into this oven stage instead. That is equipment and its process. But when you look at, well, could you change the process? No, the equipment capability doesn't allow us to. Now you see, oh, that's not a process issue, that's an equipment issue. It helps us to identify when we're looking at waste and then when we're evaluating that process map to say, is this something in our control? Is this something reasonable? Does making this change give us a good ROI? Because, I asked Leo, is Barry doing any of these things? Well, if it was going to promise a really good ROI, return on investment for those efforts, if it would have been quickly profitable, I bet Barry would be pursuing it, or at least have it on their radar. If they're not pursuing it, then it's probably not something that is actually going to give the benefit um, that you might expect. And so understanding how all of these various facets of the process and of the problem and of the non-value added activities relate to one another is really critical here as we look through using these tools. Now we have to be able to communicate this, which is why we have A3 reports. And A3 reports are able to take the information from our problem solving process and put it into a clear communication. A3 reports specifically are referring to the paper size and throwback to when lean was popular. A3 was the largest size paper that could go through a fax machine. And so that's why A3 reports were generated. But if you look at the format of a PDCA cycle and an A3, kind of overlay the two of them, you'll see that the initial documentation is all part of that plan strategy. This part up here is the actions that need to be taken. This, you see the effects, that check, stopping to see what has happened. Did we actually solve the problem? Is this a workable solution? Before we actually create that to be the new system. So again, we need to do that check because maybe there's unintended consequences. Maybe we didn't solve it the way we thought it would. Maybe we do the change and then we get feedback that it's not working. So Braden Weasling did his senior design at a place that makes the seats that go into Chevys primarily. And GM is their primary customer, like 90% of their business. And they were upgrading their lines with some additional automation. And for his senior design, he developed this in conjunction with the engineers and the maintenance people. And they had talked to the operators, and the operators were excited about the new automation. It was going to make their job easier. So they were excited about that. And they implemented it and actually installed all of the equipment, and it slowed it down. It did the exact opposite. Instead of giving them a stable takt time that actually could meet customer demand, it slowed the process down. So quality was good, but productivity went terribly. What had happened was the operators were able to later explain to the engineers of different things that were not captured because they hadn't thought that they were important. It wasn't a documented procedure, but it was additional tasks. And the new layout actually made it like 3 times harder to get those additional tasks done. And so these undocumented process steps that had never been captured were now thwarting the actual operations. And so, with the new understanding of what the process actually occurred, they had to shut down the line again, move everything, and then start up. And then they got the results they wanted. So that's what happened in that check situation, that they did it, they made the improvement, but it didn't actually give them the results that they wanted. And so they had to make modifications before they could actually create that final system. So when we think about improving a process, and if you haven't taken notes for any of this, write this down. These 5 things are the things that you need to keep in mind, because we're going to pick out our projects and start talking about what your Six Sigma project might include next week. And as we're doing that, you need to be thinking of these 5 things. So we can improve a process by doing the same process with less resources. This can be machine hours. This could be labor hours. This could be raw materials. There's a whole lot of things that are resources. You could be making a process more green by reducing the carbon footprint that it has. You could be increasing a value stream by recycling out of your process. Barry's actually really good at that, by capturing their waste and reusing it. So reducing resources can mean a whole lot of different things. But when you can do the same process with less, you just made your operating costs go down, which means your profitability went up. The next thing is to reduce errors. So anytime, whether it's mistake proofing or it's a new process technique, maybe it's a training exercise that helps operators do their job better, maybe it's PMing the equipment more frequently so you don't take the line down as often. Whatever the case may be, that you reduce errors. So again, this isn't always just poking at the operators. This can be things involving equipment. This can be things involving your actual process or your standard operating procedure. This could be things involving the process flow. All of those things can impact how many errors you have. Meet or exceed expectations of internal or external customers. So this is talking about raising your quality, right? It's not exactly reducing errors, but when you're meeting or exceeding expectations of those customers, how are we getting the right thing to them the first time? That's the goal, is it's in the right place at the right time without any errors, so that they can do their next step, whether it's a point of use customer and their next step is to just use the product, or it's an internal customer and they have to do the next piece of the process. Anytime we are able to get it to them in the right place, the right time, the right quantity, in the right condition, we're meeting and exceeding expectations. Safety, always improvement through safety. That's always going to be a good thing to do. So it could be that you see a process and you think about your project and you're not seeing opportunities for improving the process directly, but you see ways that you can help protect the workers, or you can protect the raw materials, or you can better protect the equipment. So safer, again, can mean a lot of different things, but making the process more safe is always going to be a good call. And then finally, making the process more satisfying. Now, this gets into worker psychology, which I don't know if any of you are taking Becklinger's ergonomics class and whether or not she's gotten to this yet. There were a lot of experiments done in the late 1800s, early 1900s that identified that worker satisfaction had a great impact on quality and productivity. When you have high worker satisfaction, you also typically have lower turnover. And so in a time when labor is not plentiful and you can't just throw more workers at it, or you can't just hire new workers, if you get rid of old workers, having the process be satisfying is actually a really big value add. Companies are spending a lot of money at looking at how they can increase the satisfaction of their employees. Some of that might be offering remote work. Some of that might be offering a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week. Some of that could be offering helpful things, on-site childcare, having some companies have gone to providing free hot lunch. That they had a dining facility and previously people had to pay for it, and they've gone to a free hot lunch instead. And some of these things, although they do cost money, they cost a lot less money than full salaries, benefit packages, the weighted cost of a single person. So giving raises is actually extraordinarily expensive when you add in the tax implications and the total packages across all of your employees. It actually might be a lot cheaper to rebuild a room with a foosball table and tell people that they can take breaks as needed, mental health breaks, to disengage with the process for a little bit and come back to it, or having a gym that is free to them on site, or a gym membership that is free to them. All those are things that you can do to make the employment more satisfying, even if you don't change the process. But sometimes changing the process could be changing the work design so that it's less stressful on them, so that it alleviates lower back pain, so that they have better lighting to function. All of those things increase productivity and quality. So when we think about improving a process, when you think about your own projects for this course, which is really the only major graded assignment is your project for this course, it should fall into one of these 5 areas. And in fact, your project proposal is going to have just check boxes. Sometimes you check more than one. Okay, here's Duke. Sorry, this is my dog. Well, one of my dogs. Yes, Duke. Sometimes you might be able to simultaneously make the process safer and more satisfying, or you can make it safer and reduce the number of resources. So you're not limited to one, but if you have a project and it doesn't fall into any of these categories, I'm kind of wondering why you have that project, why you're looking at that if it doesn't do any of these things. And so typically lean projects are executed through something called Kaizen, which is a small good change. And part of this perspective is recognizing that every small good change is a good change. I don't know about you, but this picture on the left of the screen, the very messy office, like if that was my payroll person, I would not feel a high degree of confidence. I don't know if any of you work with people whose desks look like this all the time, and you're just like, they're going to lose my stuff. Or even your professors. You see a desk that looks like this, and you're wondering like, oh no, did they lose my homework? Did they lose my quiz? You have a lower degree of confidence, and not that people need to be neatniks, but when your workspace is not organized, it adds waste. You are going to spend some time searching for things. I had a boss, anytime he asked me to do something, I always, in addition to saving it, I always had a second printed copy because he liked everything printed, and he lost it because his desk looked worse than that. And he was always losing things that I gave him, and he would want it right away. He'd be like, where's that thing that I asked for? And I was like, I gave it to you. And he's like, I can't find it. And so I always had, it was a folder that was called, Glenn. That was his name, not Glenn Kissel, by the way. But it was called Glenn. And it was all the copies of everything that I had ever given him. So I always had a backup copy to hand to him right in that moment because he lost everything. That's over processing. That was extra work on me that didn't need to be done, plus the time that he spent searching for it before he started shouting out his office door that he couldn't find it. So even little things like a clean desk can make a difference. My father-in-law was a vice president of operations at a medical device company, and he was one of the leaders of the lean organization in Lafayette, the Wabash Valley Lean Association. He was the chair of that. And one of the things that he noted was just how these three statements can really help you think about a Kaizen event. Just a small, good change. You recognize a problem, you see how a small change could improve it, and then you look at the results that come from that. And he did a really simple exercise in this that he noticed that he had that post-lunch lull, and a lot of people do. He got up and went around to see all of his direct reports. And so he had a timer set at 3:30 because sometimes we don't notice that we're slowing down or that our minds are wandering. It just kind of happens. We feel sluggish, but we don't notice that we're being less productive. And so because he had an office job and there was no like assembly line running at a specific time that would prevent that from happening, he set a timer in his office to an alarm to always go off at 3:30. And if he wasn't in a meeting, he would get up and walk around and he would go see all of his direct reports. And oftentimes those meetings were some of the most beneficial times. Those impromptu kind of walk and talk style meetings were some of the most productive meetings he would have in a day because it was addressing what was happening right then in that moment. And that FaceTime, people will say things to you face to face that they don't think to put in an email. Because you're able to ask questions synchronously, you're able to engage with it in real time. And so they were actually super productive meetings that all he did was put an alarm in his phone so that it reminded him to get up and go see his people. But it also kind of shook him awake. And he typically worked till 6 p.m. every day. And so those last couple of hours became a lot more productive for him. And the idea is that all of these little benefits, these little gains add up, and the cascading effect is very impactful. The other thing that's helpful is that quick wins can help morale. When you have a small project that is quickly implemented and works, people get excited about it. People are excited to see how they can make changes and have an impact. And so small quick wins can actually be useful, not just because of the productivity, but it can also help to boost morale. And so we'll be doing these types of pages, these Kaizen forms, which are very similar to the PDCA forms in our projects as well, because it's a Lean Six Sigma. So part of our defined process, we'll be breaking out some smaller tasks that can be Kaizen events, and we'll be using these to look at our Kaizen. So everything's a process. Every process has waste. Every process can be improved. And so even though you guys might work in all different places or have all different points of application, the idea of continuous improvement is what's going to drive this forward. And that layer of continuous improvement and problem solving for the small, quick wins overlaid with our very formalized, data-driven, statistically oriented DMAIC process, combine the two of those, and you're able to enact a larger scale project with great impact, embedding lots of quick wins along the way, which is part of what we're going to do for our Lean Six Sigma. So when we come in on Monday, Wednesday, we will be starting with the textbook. Hopefully you guys have been able to access that PDF easily in Blackboard. If you haven't looked at that, I'm going to just share my screen itself. If you haven't looked in Blackboard in the content section, again, the textbook is right here. So anytime I'm referring to the PIES-Deck textbook, it's just that PDF link. And then we'll also be getting into some case studies as we move forward. So obviously we didn't have a quiz today. We're a little bit off schedule here because the intro lean lecture just took a lot longer than I had anticipated. And so this schedule here isn't really reflective of what we were going to be doing. There will be a quiz on Wednesday. The first case study will move to the following week. But the following week, at the end of Wednesday, we will be talking about potential project proposals. The proposals themselves aren't due till February, but I want to be hearing from you guys what you're thinking about doing. So next week, we'll be talking about them, about what they might include. And then by February, you'll be developing, that first week of February, you'll be developing a more extensive outline for what that would include. Are there any questions?
Is our quiz,
You can
go
go,
ahead.
Josh. You go, Josh.
Is our quiz Wednesday on just the content that we've done in this lecture on Intro to Lean?
Yeah, it's just the content from the intro lecture to Lean. And so it'll be just a quick 5-question multiple choice quiz. Because the green belt exam is multiple choice, except for, well, no, it's multiple choice. There are a couple that you have to solve mathematically and then select the right answer, but it's a multiple choice exam. So all of these little quizzes will all be multiple choice exam quizzes in that same format. So it'll be just little things on, there'll be some terminology. I can tell you one of the questions that is on every exam, certification exam, is like, which one of these is not one of the classic 8 wastes? So, you know, knowing the 8 wastes would be helpful, because that's always going to be a question. Another one of the questions is kind of definition based, like, you know, which process tool uses the benefit of a diagram that includes various potential sources to determine an action. And it might mention like people, equipment, method, you know, that's a fishbone, right? So I would look at the tools, like if you were going back through the slide deck, the classic 8 wastes, the list of that, the overview slide for each of the tools. I would look at those. So it's that those types of questions, but it's four selections, A through D, every time. Not 5 choices, it's 4 choices. And it'll just be a couple quick things, multiple choice on Wednesday in class. And I'll fix this Blackboard so it actually reflects what we're actually doing. Any other questions? Tyler, was that what you were going to ask too?
Yeah, more or less.
Okay. All right. I know a bunch of you are walking over to Kicklighter's class. And if you see anybody wandering the halls, I had Kicklighter put a sign on my door to do office hours via Zoom today. But if you see somebody wandering around looking for me, please tell them to just jump into my Zoom room. But all right, I'm going to end this meeting and close out the recording, and